Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be back to in-person events, so thank you for coming. It's really nice to see this room with faces in it again and not just, a boring Zoom screen. My name is Bonnie Adderstrom. I'm the Assistant Events Director here at Brookline Booksmith. Today, it is my pleasure to host Keith O'Brien to celebrate his book, Paradise Falls. Before I introduce Keith, I just have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, please keep your phones off or on silent for the duration of the event, and thank you for helping keep this event enjoyable for everyone. Secondly, copies of the book will be available for sale at the back counter over there. If you pre-ordered a copy or you want to buy a copy, I'll be back there at the end of the event, and Keith will be back at that table to sign, so that'll be great. Make sure you stop and check that out. And then finally, we will have a Q&A at the end of the event, so be sure to hold your questions, but definitely have them ready. And now for the fun part. Tonight's author, Keith O'Brien, has written for the New York Times, Politico, and the Boston Globe. As a newspaper reporter, he won multiple awards, including the Casey Medal for Meritorious. He has also been a finalist for the Penn ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. A longtime contributor to National Public Radio, he has appeared on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and This American Life, among other programs. The New York Times Book Review has hailed O'Brien for his keen reportorial eye and lyrical writing style. He's written 3 books, including called Outside Shot, Fly Girls, and Paradise Falls, which of course we're all here to celebrate. He was born in Cincinnati and graduated from Northwestern University, and he currently lives in New Hampshire with his wife and 2 kids. Now, to tell you a little bit about the book, Paradise Falls tells the story of Lois Gibbs, Luella Kenny, and the other mothers who loved their neighborhood on the east side of Niagara Falls. In the spring of 1977, pungent odors began to seep into these little houses, and it didn't take long for worried mothers to identify the curious scent. The school and playground had been built atop an old canal. The Love Canal, it was called. The city's largest employer, Hooker Chemical, had quietly filled this canal with 20,000 tons of toxic waste in the 40s and 50s. This waste was now leaching to the surface, causing a public health crisis the likes of which America had never seen before. O'Brien braids together the previously unknown stories of Hooker Chemical's deeds, the local newspapermen, scientists, and congressional staffer who tried to help, the city and state officials who didn't, and of course the heroic women who stood up to corporate and governmental indifference to save their families and their children. The book has been lauded in Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, Chicago Review of Books, and more as a deeply thorough and extensively researched book that offers insight not only into the history of an environmental catastrophe, but also into our present circumstances and the contemporary activist movement that we see today. Thank you all so much for being here. Please give a warm welcome to Keith O'Brien.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks so much for that, and thank you all for coming out tonight in person. This radical retro idea of actually doing things in person. So I'm gonna talk, of course, tonight about this big story, the story of one of the great environmental crises of the 20th century, how it emerged, what happened, why it still matters today, and mostly about those women that Bonnie just mentioned, these ordinary mothers who really forced this story into the spotlight and almost by accident ended up changing the world. It is, a story of resistance. It's a story of epic proportions. In the span of 2 years, these women would go from being ignored by their local officials, their school board, their superintendent, to having the ear of Jimmy Carter in the White House and staring down one of the most powerful corporate executives in America at the time. So this is the story of Paradise Falls. But I wanted to begin tonight with something much smaller. I wanted to begin with a small moment behind the scenes of my research, of my reporting. I wanted to begin tonight with the story of a bird. In one of my very first interviews, I interviewed a woman named Luella Kenny. She was a mother of 3 boys on the east side of Niagara Falls in the 1970s. who with her husband Norman had purchased this house here on 96th Street. And it was for the Kennys a perfect place to raise a family. The house was located on the northern edge of a tidy grid of streets about 6 miles east of the waterfalls that we all know. This is the neighborhood looking north on this side and looking to the south on the left side. The neighborhood was called LaSalle, and though the houses there were small, single-story ranches, all of them, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms at most, it was a desirable place to live. People here were really scraping their way to the middle class on factory workers' wages, and they were primarily young families. And the children liked to gather on a wide expanse of open land that you can see here, a little rectangle running right down the middle of the neighborhood that the kids called simply the playground. Now, many residents like us, the adults, wondered why that rectangular piece of land had never really fully been developed. But the kids really didn't care because the land for them was magical. There was a school at the heart of it. There was a playground on weekday afternoons, on weekends. Their friends were there on the playground. It was the reason why many people had moved here in the first place. But the Kennys had another reason. Their house was on the northern edge of this neighborhood, back there in the corner at an elbow turn in a little modified cul-de-sac there. And it backed up into a confluence of creeks that really gave them one of the largest yards in the neighborhood. A great place for the Kenny boys to play. In summer, they would be out there sloshing through those creeks, catching crawdads. In winter, they would skate on them. And then in 1978, a problem. People in the neighborhood began to learn about secrets that had been buried beneath that school, beneath that playground. One of the Kenny boys began to get sick with a set of mysterious symptoms that local doctors could not solve. And Luella Kenny, being a mother, began to focus all of her attention now on her son, on her house, on that yard, on those creeks. Luella began to wonder what was in that water. In the months ahead, Luella would actually go out to those creeks, and she would crouch down at the water's edge, and she would keep a journal. She would keep a log of what she saw there, a journal that she kept her whole life until she shared it with me. And in this journal, she would note things like water level high, some oil slicks murky, deep orange appearance, odor permeates the air, oil slicks moving down creek, deep orange color from drain to point where a major part of creek is starting, odor is present in an entire backyard. And that brings me back to the story of the bird. In research and reporting, people sometimes tell you things that seem too fantastic, too alarming, too crazy, or too good to be true. And in those moments, as a nonfiction storyteller, you ask yourself, could this really be real? Did this really happen? And if so, how could I ever prove that and use this scene in my book? And the bird story for me is really one of these moments. For Luella, it was just a memory. She said that one day, when she was back there at the creeks, she was joined by 2 scientists. And on this day, she said, she turned away from the scientists for a moment and walked back toward her house, and then heard the 2 men speaking in loud voices. And one of them, she said, was running up through the trees. And she told me that the man asked her if they could store something in her freezer. A small songbird had just landed in the edge of the creek and dipped its beak into the water that Luella was increasingly convinced was contaminated and perhaps the source of her family's problems. And then the bird promptly fell over. It was dead. So that story unfolded something like 43 years ago. And part of the challenge for me in writing this book was parsing fact from fiction, truth from lies, especially when so many lies were told for so long in Niagara Falls about what was there. It was a process that took me over 130 hours of interviews, thousands of documents, some of which had never seen the light of day before. Even now, 42 years later, since my narrative ended, I had to file Freedom of Information requests with the state of New York in order to receive certain documents. And when I did receive those documents at times, they were heavily redacted. And of course, I was doing all of this either on the cusp of or in the thick of the lockdown pandemic, which we can all admit was like the worst time of our lives. So it was, quite a challenge, and it is, of course, exciting to share it with you guys here tonight. So I just want to give you a little bit of foundation about the issue and the characters at play here, and then, I'll be happy to have a conversation and answer any questions you might have. For starters, when we think of Niagara Falls, most of us think of it like this. Perhaps you've been there, to the waterfalls, right? This postcard, beautiful place with the honeymooners strolling up and down the Esplanade there. Deep into the 1960s, this still was the honeymoon capital of the world. But the real work of Niagara Falls, and the real Niagara Falls, is just a couple miles away, and it looks like this. This is a photo from the 1970s, but it still looks much like this today. Chemical plants dotted the landscape up and down the Niagara River there. You had DuPont, Carborundum, Union Carbide, and you had this place called Hooker Chemical. And at points in the 20th century, Hooker was both the largest industrial taxpayer in town and the largest employer. In many ways, with its tax dollars, kept the lights on, built the schools, financed the snowplows, and did other good work, providing the chemicals that we need for the rubber soles of our shoes or our fire retardant sofas, and also supporting local schools, local artists. But most importantly, Hooker provided jobs. At its peak, Hooker Chemical supplied about 3,000 local jobs. And if you were a man, in particular, if you were a white man, and you did, by the way, have to be a white man, you could make it all the way to the top at Hooker Chemical. You could have a corner office, travel the world, you could fly on the corporate jet. And if you were really lucky, you could fly on the corporate jet with the man who would acquire Hooker Chemical in 1968. He was one of the wealthiest businessmen in America with the most powerful lawyers. He was the chairman of Occidental Petroleum. That's Arm & Hammer. So for all the good work Hooker does, the jobs it supplies, the profits it generates, the company did also create its fair share of problems, at times shocking problems in Niagara Falls. At that plant there along the river, workers were injured with alarming regularity. And neighbors often suffered too, living in noxious fumes, clouds that wafted up and down the river. Workers also died, again, with alarming regularity, in explosions, chemical fires, accidents at times that defied explanation. At least twice in the 1960s, the manhole covers on Buffalo Avenue, right in front of the plant, popped and blew, skittering into oncoming traffic like giant frisbees. And of course, worst of all, there were these secrets that were buried primarily on the east side of town, in the Wella Kenny's neighborhood. Secrets that people in power in Niagara Falls knew, but that no one else did. In the 1940s and 50s, Hooker buried about 21,000 tons of chemical waste, residues and waste, right there on that rectangular strip of land. And they buried it in an old abandoned canal that had been carved in the 1890s by a man named William T. Love, the Love Canal. And you know, my research makes clear that as early as 1946, Hooker knew it had a problem out there. In a memo from August 1946, they write, this is an internal memo between executives, they write that we are now in the embarrassing position of having used this property for a dump for some 3 years without ownership or even permission. But 2 days later, the lead corporate attorney for Hooker wanted the CEO to know that actually he had concerns that were far greater than just permission. He said that he had been to the site himself, and while he wasn't a scientist in any way, what he saw there concerned him as a lawyer. And he said here that to my inexperienced eye, it seemed clear that the water was contaminated. More worrisome, he said, children seem to be using the dump, this old canal, as a swimming pool. Quote, walking down the path with what seemed to be bathing costumes in their hands. And given all of that, the attorney concluded, Hooker Chemicals seemed to be running, he said, a real hazard, quote. 6 years later, in the spring of 1952, these hazards had really only grown. The city was growing, as many cities were in America in the post-war years. The population moving to Niagara Falls for those chemical jobs was pushing east into those rural parts of the city. More and more they were encroaching upon the land. And of course, there was more chemicals in that ground at that point than there had been in 1946. And I wanted to mention 3 in particular. There was something in the ground called thionyl chloride, which was a pale yellow liquid with an irritating odor. For most of us, that compound means nothing, but it was crucial to the work of Hooker Chemical. It is the fundamental compound of mustard gas. Lindane was in the landfill. This is a white powdery element used to make pesticides. And then there was something called 1,2,4,5 tetrachlorobenzene. This is a white odorless solid, insoluble in water, and also a fundamental part of pesticides. But more concerning, it was known to create a particular byproduct, dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to science, and of course, the fundamental compound at the heart of Agent Orange. So that spring, when the school board approaches Hooker to acquire this land, the company all but jumps at the chance. And through internal memos that spring, there's much debate about how to handle it, but they ultimately decide that if we can determine that the land is safe and we can cover it, we could do the city a favor of offering them this land for $1. And so they do that. And up goes that school, and around it grows a neighborhood, Luella Kenny's neighborhood. And it should be noted that the problems here begin almost immediately. Children report in the 1950s and 60s suffering from burns on their skin and in their eyes. At times, small fires break out on this old landfill. On at least one occasion, a buried drum of thionyl chloride, the fundamental compound of mustard gas, explodes on a quiet Sunday morning underground and scatters its contents along the road and nearby houses. And maybe most shocking to me is a legend that the children all discussed. They said that rocks on the playground would spontaneously combust, would catch on fire. Now again, this seems absurd, right? And frankly, I didn't believe it. But in every interview I did with people who grew up here in the 60s and 70s, they all talked about the fire rocks. And then one day in the library in Niagara Falls, going through old microfilm of the Niagara Gazette, I found this story here. The story said that a school principal had notified city officials that children were finding material on the playground that would catch fire. And one of these rocks even burst into flames in a boy's pants pocket. And the city's top health official at the time, a man named Ernest Gideon, wanted people to know that he was worried, and he was concerned that these rocks might pose what he called a fire hazard. But his solution to the problem was as follows, and I quote, he advised that anyone finding the material, these rocks, should immediately submerge it or underwater or bury it. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have two boys. If they found rocks that caught on fire, it would be the greatest thing they had ever found. And I can assure you they would not bury them underwater or in the ground. So, a series of poor decisions has led to an unprecedented problem in the heart of American neighborhood, filled with 1,000 families, black and white. And then in 1977, this problem begins to emerge in ways that cannot be ignored anymore. And my characters, the characters in Paradise Falls, emerge and really begin to fight back. And I just want to introduce you to them briefly now. For starters, there's Bonnie Casper. Now, Bonnie's there in the striped patterned shirt right in the middle. She was a young congressional aide for this man here in the tie, John LaFalce, who was the congressman from Niagara Falls at the time. John LaFalce would actually serve as congressman for that district for about 3 decades. But at the time, he was newly elected. And Bonnie Casper was his low-paid legislative aide, one of about 6 people working in his Washington, D.C. office. And, you know, in my early reporting, of course, I tracked down John LaFalce, who is still alive, and I did a couple interviews with him. But he quickly said to me, you know who you really need to talk to is Bonnie. And he had lost touch with Bonnie. And unfortunately, Casper is a relatively common name. And also, as a reporter, as a journalist, you never know if women are changing their names. So it did take a little bit of time to track down Bonnie. But I finally did. And she's a commercial real estate broker today in Bethesda, Maryland, still alive. I conducted multiple interviews with her, and in the very first interview, Bonnie said, you know, this was like the biggest thing I ever worked on, and I saved all my boxes. I saved all my stuff. And I said, when can I come to DC to see your stuff? And this is pre-pandemic. It's late 2019. I fly down to Maryland. I meet her in her commercial real estate office. She had more boxes than I had accounted for, and it was quickly clear I would not be able to go through them in the time I had allotted. And so Bonnie said, go ahead and take them home. So I bought an extra piece of luggage, and I packed up the boxes, and I flew back with them to New Hampshire. And really, it's Bonnie who's there at the inception of learning about these problems. It's Bonnie telling John LaFalce, you've got to go see it. You've got to go out there. There's Beverly Pagan, a scientist from nearby Buffalo, who I wrote about actually in last Sunday's Boston Globe magazine. Beverly, unlike most of the characters in this story, did not live in the neighborhood. She had no stake in this fight. She lived about 25 minutes away in Buffalo, where she was a PhD level biologist working for a place called Roswell Park. This is a medical and research institute that's affiliated with the University at Buffalo and also under the umbrella of the State Department of Health. And Beverly here was a little bit ahead of her time. She struggled to get hired as a scientist, as a PhD level female scientist in the late 1960s. But when she caught on at Roswell Park, she really began to focus her research on this nascent idea that our environment could affect our health. And she does early studies suggesting that cigarette smoking can be tied to cancer. And of course, when this problem emerges effectively in her own backyard, she goes out to help. And she wants to run some tests. And she quickly comes to the conclusion by November 1978, just 3 months after this crisis is blown up, that she believes the risks are far greater and more widespread than her bosses do in Albany. And she will make that case privately, and when they don't listen to her, she will make that case publicly. And she knows as she's doing it that she's putting her career on the line, she's putting her job on the line. And again, I was fortunate enough to meet and interview Beverly. Tracked her down at the end of 2019. She was living no longer in New York. She had left there shortly after the crisis was over, effectively pushed out of her job. She was living in Bar Harbor, Maine, and had worked the last 30 years of her life at Jackson Laboratory, a place some of you will know. And so I go up to Maine, and I find her at the end of this dirt road on Mount Desert Island. And I interviewed Beverly over the course of 2 days at her home there in Maine. And just like Bonnie Casper, she had saved everything and said, I have a lot of stuff related to this, like a whole file cabinet, maybe 4 drawers, and several boxes. And she says, I'd be happy to give them to you if you could return them. And so of course, I took those with me too. I'm just sad to say that unfortunately Beverly did not live to see this book come out. She died in the summer of 2020, just 4 months after I found her there in Maine. There's Aline Thornton, a mother of 6 who lives on the downtown side of the old canal in a modern public housing development called Griffin Manor. This was desirable public housing in the city of Niagara Falls, roughly half black, half white. And Aline had lived there for quite a long time. And when the problems emerged in 1977-78, she immediately began to think about her third child, Gregory Thornton, who was born there in that public housing development in 1960. But didn't even make it to his 2nd birthday. Gregory Thornton died of leukemia. And Aline couldn't help but wonder, as the story started to make the newspaper, is what I'm reading now in the paper, is what was buried in beneath the canal, is that connected to my son's death? There's Lois Gibbs, who more than anyone else really becomes the face of this problem. In 1977, in the months before this issue emerges, she is a housewife, as they said at the time, a stay-at-home mom, mother of 2 kids right here, Michael and Melissa Gibbs. And she's a factory worker's wife who had barely graduated from high school. And in fact, Lois is so self-conscious in her young adult life that she is not intelligent, that she won't even speak up at teacher conferences or PTA meetings. But when she learns about these issues in the ground, she does what a lot of parents do. She immediately connects it to her own life. And in this fall of 1977, young Michael Gibbs right there began attending kindergarten at that school on top of the old landfill and playground. And within 3 months of attending that school, Michael Gibbs, previously completely healthy, is now suffering from seizures. And so in the spring of 78, when she begins to read the stories, she also wonders if it's connected, the chemicals in the ground and my son's problems. And she does at that point what any mother would do. She goes to the school board. And the superintendent, and she makes a modest request. She asks them to move Michael in the fall of 78. She wants them to move him to a different school. But the school superintendent is committed that there is no danger at this school, and he will not move her child. And Lois becomes angry and begins to go door to door in her neighborhood, gathering petitions gathering signatures on a petition to shut down the school. That's all she wants to do at that point. She wants to shut down the school until we can learn more. And so she's blown away in August 1978 when the state actually says, we are going to shut down the school, and we're also going to recommend evacuation for 230 families. And Lois, unfortunately, is not one of those families. She lives outside the first evacuation zone. Her home effectively is looking out over a landscape now filled with abandoned houses. And she, with Beverly Pagan, Aline Thornton, Bonnie Casper, begin to build a case to leave their homes. And for Lois, it really will take a toll. She becomes a lightning rod of controversy. There are people who support her. There are people who do not. There are people who believe her. There are people who do not. And in this fight, her marriage will fall apart. But in the span of 2 years, she will, more than anyone else, get the attention of the White House. And in the fall of 1980, Jimmy Carter will personally invite her on stage and thank her for what she did in Love Canal. And then finally, of course, there's Luella Kenny. She will be the one who stares down Arm & Hammer, a mother of three, personally picking that fight. And for me, that was relatively easy to confirm and build out. It was covered by newspapers. I ultimately interviewed multiple witnesses, and I unearthed a transcript of this final showdown that was in an archive at Columbia University, of all places. But the story of the bird was much harder to track down. On research trips to Niagara Falls and Buffalo and the State Archives in Albany and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., there was nothing about a bird dying in a creek. And then one day I was actually right here in Massachusetts. I was here in Boston, and I was at Tufts University. And I was reviewing Lois Gibbs's papers. Because years ago, Lois Gibbs had been given an honorary degree by Tufts. And sort of as a way to thank them, she donated her papers to Tufts. Boxes upon boxes, everything she had kept, letters she wrote and received from in this little window of time in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And in these boxes, there were two large files, very thick, labeled daily reports. And these reports were written by a state scientist who was offered up as a consultant to the residents of the neighborhood, to the homeowners. He was working for them as sort of a third-party advocate. And his name was Stephen Lester, and these daily reports were really just a way to prove that he, this young scientist, was actually doing something, that he was actually earning his money. In fact, at the top of these reports, it said work voucher daily report. There were a few hundred of them over the course of a couple of years. And some of them are 3 to 4 pages long. And they're filled with dense scientific language, recounting chemical figures or sketching something out about the remediation. So it's not the most interesting reading. But for me, this is like gold, historian gold, because this was a timestamp that tracked all the way through the narrative, written by a third party, an objective party, who was at the table, who was in the room, and who had actually recorded it in real time. Not later, but in real time. So deep in the library at Tufts, I'm reading his reports closely in late 2019 and early 2020. I'm scanning them all with my phone. And my eyes are glazing over at times, and I'm wondering, what in the world am I doing in the library at Tufts? And then I get to the spring of 1979. And Stephen Lester begins to write in his daily reports that he is now visiting homes in the neighborhood. And he's visiting them, he said, with a second scientist. And this rings a bell, of course, because Luella Kenny had mentioned 2 scientists. So I start reading more closely, and I get to June 7th, 1979. It was a Thursday. It was warm and cloudy in Niagara Falls. Rain was moving in overnight. And the daily report that day for Stephen Lester begins the way all of them do. He simply logs his hours. He says, I worked from 9 a.m. to 5:30. And he starts by saying they're doing some remediation on the canal, they're cutting down some trees, they're putting up a fence, and we're visiting a, quote, number of houses on this day. And one of these homes, he said, was on 96th Street, 1064 96th Street, and belonged to a woman named Mrs. Kinney, Kinney. He misspells her name because, of course, Stephen Lester does not know Luella. But the rest he gets right. He says she had complained of chemical odors in the back of her home in the creek, which borders her property. It was quite obvious, he added, that the chemicals were indeed present in this creek. And then down at the bottom of the page, in a file containing hundreds of pages, in a collection containing thousands of documents, in a small room inside a library that almost no one visits, Stephen Lester writes something that stops me. While we were visiting Mrs. Kinney, he said, a bird which was feeding in the creek collapsed and died. Stephen Lester, still alive today. He actually would later marry Lois Gibbs, so he was easy to find. Dr. Stephen Kim, the second scientist mentioned here, also alive today, and I found him too. And in that moment, finding this, I knew a few things. I knew Luella Kenny was telling the truth. And I believed in that moment that Bonnie Casper and Lois Gibbs and Aline Thornton and Beverly Pagan were too. And it really, at that point, it was just up to me to keep going, to find those documents, to do those interviews, to do the work. I was all alone in that library, but I was on the right path. So that's the story that I wanted to share tonight. It's a small group. If you'd like, I'll read the first 2 pages, or we can just skip that. You guys can decide.
Read it.
Want me to read it?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just going to read the first 6 paragraphs. So I really wanted to write the book as it unfolded. And by that I mean, if you lived there in 1976 or 77, you thought you had a good life. You thought you were in a good spot. And you had that house, or you were living in that really nice public housing development, and you were walking to this school. And I wanted to capture the sense of that feeling. And yet, in my research, there were all these incident reports that never really saw the light of day, that just happened behind the scenes and then just disappeared. And so I decided pretty early on, after gathering my material, that I was going to start as almost a prelude with one of these moments, sort of setting up what's to come. And so the introduction is May 14th, 1972. So we're about 6 years before things explode in this neighborhood. It was a Sunday afternoon, almost summer in Niagara Falls, and the children from the little bungalows on the east side of town scampered outside to play. The parents, mostly factory workers and housewives, didn't follow them. No adults were going to lord over the kids with rules and warnings that afternoon, because everyone knew the LaSalle neighborhood was safe, and everyone knew where the kids were going. To the playground, they called it. A rectangular expanse of open land around the elementary school between 97th and 99th Streets in the heart of the neighborhood. There were some play structures there, a swing set, a slide, and a baseball diamond too. But mostly the grounds were wild. Nearly 16 acres of grassland growing in clumps, untended and untamed. Parents sometimes wondered why no one had developed the property, dropped in among the tidy rows of single-story starter homes. It seemed as if someone should have built a real park there years ago. But the children asked no questions, because for them, the land was perfect. The vacant lot to end all lots. A place filled with possibility and maybe even magic. The older boys, straddling their dirt bikes and tight shorts and white tube socks, told fantastic tales of rocks at the playground that burst into flames, that spontaneously combusted. They said they'd seen it with their own eyes. Debbie Gallo, 11 years old, with dark hair and hazel eyes, wasn't sure what to believe about the fire rocks. Her father was a welder, a son of Italian immigrants, and a Korean War veteran who walked with a limp from the shrapnel that had carved up one of his knees. The Gallos felt fortunate just to own a home in the neighborhood, and Debbie felt lucky that it was this one, on 97th Street. Her little one-story house, white with olive green shutters, looked right out over the school and the empty land. She could be on the playground almost before the front door slammed behind her, skipping across the street to the open lot. On weekdays, it meant that she didn't have to walk far to get to her 5th grade class at the school. On weekends, it meant that her front yard seemed to stretch on like the sea, forever, with friends floating everywhere, coming and going on roller skates and bicycles. This Sunday was one of those days, so Debbie laced up her shoes and headed outside. It was warm and windy. A spring storm was coming. But Debbie and her girlfriends paid the weather and the boys around them no mind. While the boys churned up the dust at the playground with their bicycles, clattering here and there on narrow paths carved into the high grass, the girls set about creating something pretty, sidewalk art. At their feet, they began gathering chunks of rock to use as chalk. The rocks were soft and white, the whitest white I'd ever seen, Debbie would say later. And best of all, they were easy for the girls to find amid the topsoil. Debbie took one in each hand, ran them between her fingers, and then got down on her knees to draw on the concrete. Later, she couldn't remember how much time elapsed before her eyes began to burn. Had she been playing with the rocks for 5 minutes or 15 seconds? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that rubbing her eyes only made them worse. As she pulled her hands away, the pain came on like a wave, hot and searing. Her eyes burned as if from the inside, and then she was screaming, and she was running, stumbling across the playground, trying to find her way back to her house on 97th Street through a haze of tears and gauzy darkness. It wasn't just the pain that worried Debbie at this point. It was the panic growing inside her. Panic over a realization that was hard to explain to her mother back at the house. Debbie Gallo couldn't open her eyes. She couldn't see. For one brief and scary moment, she was blind. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Keith, for being out here. We do have a Q&A session. I'm going to ask that folks who have questions, I'll pass you the mic, and this is just to ensure that folks joining us on the live stream can hear what you ask. But yeah, feel free. Oh, already.
I actually have 2 questions. One, when you were talking, you had the note up about the bird.
Mhm.
They said that they sent it to Albany to have it checked to see what the cause of death was, and I wonder if you were able to get the results of that test. And the second question is, did these people ever have a lawsuit and get compensated for what was taken from them?
So the answer to the first question is, of course, I wanted to know what had killed the bird. It was impossible to find out. I never found those records. Stephen Kim, the second scientist who's mentioned there, said by his recollection that it was determined that it was some kind of virus, which of course Luella Kenny did not believe. But the truth is I don't know. As for the compensation, yes. So throughout the 1990s, lawsuit after lawsuit was filed, and most of them were settled by Hooker Chemical to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. But even now, as we sit here tonight, there are pending lawsuits related to Love Canal, 42 years later.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, man.
Quick, so this is obviously different from your previous Fly Girls where you can't interview long gone. And this is, real people that you can sit down and talk to, get firsthand accounts. How did you find them to be? Were they still angry about this? Were they, time heals all wounds? It's 50 years, but obviously you can say it's been a long time, but their children were affected and they had these, injuries. So were they still passionate and angry about this, or were they, sort of, yeah, it's in the past? How was that discussion?
with people who grew up in this neighborhood or lived in this neighborhood in the 70s, who had a stake, who had a house, who lived in the public housing development, wherever it was they lived. All you have to do is scratch the surface by mentioning Love Canal, and the emotions come rushing back. And you know, people are still very angry today. You know, some people who I interviewed, you know, are still raising children who are now in their 40s or 50s, who are still suffering from, you know, birth defects that the parents believe anyway were connected to the canal. I mean, as you know, Mark, you know, there's no way to prove causality many times with chemicals. That was true then, it's true now. I mean, if your kid gets sick and you back up into a place that is contaminated, you can make your argument that it's connected. But as doctors will tell you, we can't say for sure if the kidney disease or the miscarriage happened because of the chemicals or if it just happened. So people are still quite angry. And, you know, Luella and Lois in particular, I mean, you know, it's ironic to me that Lois Gibbs here, you know, felt like she couldn't speak up at the PTA meeting because once she slipped into the skin of this new role, she did it in a way that really very few citizen activists had done it before. And frankly, by 1980, Lois Gibbs was the most famous citizen activist in America. You know, friends with Jane Fonda, interviewed on all the morning talk shows, Phil Donahue, 60 Minutes. And as a 60 Minutes producer would say that spring, and she, the producer, meant it as a compliment, Lois Gibbs is the savviest manipulator of media that we have today. She knew how to get people's attention, and she still does today. And Luella Kenny was much older than Lois comparatively. Lois was like 27 when this started. She's quite young, a young mother. Luella was 40, and had this not happened, those two women who lived about a mile apart never would have probably known each other. Their kids were separated in school. They actually went to different schools, lived on different sides of the neighborhood. But Luella, you know, is now in her mid 80s, still alive, and is just as passionate today as she was then.
Keith, this is awesome.
Thanks, Eric.
Question for you. This is obviously a very different kind of narrative from your previous two books. What led you to this story? How did you first come across it? How did you know that this was something you wanted to commit several years to digging into and telling?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, when I came out of my last book, Fly Girls, as I think Mark just said, those people, those protagonists were gone. They were long gone. I couldn't interview them. I needed to find records and archives and memos and letters in order to do that book. And, you know, but what troubled me in the research and the writing of Fly Girls was that some of those characters, some of those women, including my main protagonist, sort of my main heroine in the end, had lived deep into the 1970s, had lived to 1979. And I really mourned the fact that nobody had tracked her down and done any kind of significant interview with her. She was this great person living among us and just disappeared and then died. And so as I came out of that, I was really just sort of asking myself, what would be stories around us right now where perhaps the people are still alive? And with that thought in mind, I immediately turned to the 70s, which I actually think is a very ripe historical time right now, because sadly for all of us, and I'm just gauging our ages in the room, the 70s is now history. And it's 40 or 50 years ago, and so I thought, okay, you know, let's dive in and maybe look around there. And, you know, I'm a child of the 80s, but I was born in the 70s, and I have memories from the 70s, little snippets, little snapshots like we all do, of our childhoods. And, you know, I remember the blizzard of 77, and I remember the gas lines and being in my mother's station wagon while we waited in the long line, and I remember the Iran hostage crisis, And I do remember this place called Love Canal. But like a lot of us, I didn't really know what it was. And so, I started digging in on a number of topics, and I started making a number of calls. And the truth is, for every book I write, there's 12 that I didn't. And it was really only after I started doing some phone interviews with Luella and Lois Gibbs and others, and starting to get a sense of the kind of documents that might be available, that I thought it would work. And for me, the ultimate key was I didn't see it by the time I was about a month in. I didn't see it anymore as history of a thing that happened long ago, just this one thing that you sort of remember. I think it is really a story of resistance in the face of impossible odds, and that I think is a story that is incredibly relevant today.
I want to thank you for the work that you put in. This is very difficult for me. I'm from Niagara Falls. I grew up on 14th Street. You talked about Love Canal being in the 90s and hundreds. And I played Little League, Gill Creek on 30th Street. And that creek, when the ball would go over the fence, some days you'd go and get the ball, and some days it was orange, and some days the ball was green, and some days the ball was blue. And you just took that as normal. For high school, I went to Bishop Duffy, which was on 65th Street, and that's less than a mile from Love Canal, and it's surrounded by the factories. We had a white Impala, and we'd wash it at night, and in the morning, it was no longer white. And many of us suffered from asthma and allergies, and so Love Canal was a target in terms of what was buried there. We all lived where the smoke, the ash, the water, we were surrounded by poison. Niagara Falls is a sad story of how you can take beauty and poison it with corporate power, political weakness. Fortunately, Lois Gibbs was a hero, but growing up in my family, Lois Gibbs was maligned because she was ruining the city. You see, and a lot of these stories are still alive today around us. When you think about political power, you think about making money however you can at the expense of our land, our water, our air. So Lois Gibbs is a hero. I became very involved in politics, in high school, and went to the University of Buffalo and went to Tufts, actually, and met Lois Gibbs. And so it's weird coming full circle in how this is hitting me. But I really appreciate the work that you put into this. I dare say lots of folks don't know Love Canal, don't know the history of Niagara Falls. And one last thing is, there are two Niagara Fallses. There's a Niagara Falls, Canada, and Niagara Falls, New York. I have many relatives on both sides. And when I grew up, we made fun of my relatives in Canada because they were backwards and they were slow, and they poured money into the land and into the ecology there. And they're doing very well right now. And Niagara Falls, when I grew up, was up to 110,000+. It's down to 40-some thousand right now. It's a very, very, very sad place. Still very beautiful, but it's very, very sad. So thank you, but I didn't know how hard this would be, but I appreciate your work.
Thank you so much for your comments. That's and I just want to say for everybody else here, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Bob.
The stories that Bob just told, in particular about the car and the paint on the car, again, is something that multiple people said again and again and again, right? So, in fact, Lois Gibbs, her husband worked at the Goodyear plant, which was just adjacent to Hooker. There was this row, that row I showed you, that truly is just one factory after another after another. And the Goodyear plant is just really across the road in kitty corner from Hooker. And it was a good job for Harry Gibbs, her husband. It paid well. It helped them buy that house on 101st Street. And before all this happened, they also would have bubbling paint on their car, often in the morning. So that they would go to bed, the car's fine. In the morning, the paint job is ruined. And Goodyear offered its employees a free new paint job once a year. And before all of these problems emerged, the Gibbses thought that was a nice thing and a nice offer. And they would happily and sort of jokingly discuss with each other every year, what color do you want to paint the car this time? And so, because it was a chemical town, and because so many people worked with chemicals, there was this familiarity that allowed people to look past the obvious problems that were everywhere. But I do agree with you that Niagara Falls could have been a beautiful place, and clearly once was a beautiful place. But it is a shocking place to see today. And I mean not just the neighborhood itself, but many parts of the city are incredibly economically challenged and depressed.
So I have a question, sort of two parts. Was this ever designated as a Superfund site? And I know I could probably Google this, but
No, don't Google it, just read the book.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. But like, what happened with the school and the currently like that area and the part that was supposed to be they were evacuating? Like, what is that now, or whatever really came of that area, and did that ever expand in terms of like what is it now?
So, very insightful question. So, without spoiling too much of the narrative, Love Canal is the original Superfund site. And the outcry that Lois Gibbs and others drive in the fall of 1978 forces EPA administrators in Washington to start doing a tally of what maybe we had in this country. And they counted up in the neighborhood of 600 abandoned, orphaned sites like this. None exactly like Love Canal, none buried underneath a school in the heart of a neighborhood, but problems. And so the EPA, in tandem as Beverly Pagan and Lois Gibbs are starting to testify and make noise, EPA administrators who are long forgotten, but were very bright lawyers and environmental scientists began to cobble together a legislative plan for a very large fund, a super fund of money. And so this is the first. And to your second question about the neighborhood itself. So in 1988, about a decade after the problems emerged, the state of New York made a very controversial decision, controversial on both sides, no matter which way you felt. They did a comprehensive study of the land, which was now by and large empty of people. Frankly, as state science goes, it's one of the most comprehensive state studies ever performed. And they determined that it was safe to resettle the western side of the neighborhood where Aline Thornton used to live in the public housing development, which was now torn down and gone, and the northern end of the neighborhood, Luella Kenny's neighborhood. I lost there we go. Anyway, Luella's neighborhood, which I'll have to go all the way back to get to. But anyway, they decided they would resettle the northern edge and the western edge. And they would not resettle everything east of the canal. So 99th, 100th, 101st Street, 102nd Street, 103rd Street, 4 blocks, about a mile long, gone. And today, if you drive into the neighborhood, as you enter from the downtown side, it looks much like it did in the 70s. The homes are there. They have been resettled. And as you cross, however, into the old school land, it is completely fenced off. Unlike other Superfund sites, it was never converted into tennis courts or a golf course or greenway. It is fenced off. And it is monitored 24/7. It's one of the most studied pieces of land in the country every day. And everything east of the canal is gone. And if you drive on those streets, it's buckled pavement. cracked roads. Most of the houses are gone. Some houses that people refuse to abandon, even when they had the opportunity to do so, but they're now gone, are just collapsing in upon themselves. It's a place of feral cats and trash dumped by people just looking to offload old furniture. It's truly it's an American wasteland, right in the heart of a mid-sized American city.
We have time for one more question, so I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Keith. This is awesome.
Thank you, Stephanie.
You said that when some of the reports you got were redacted, and you got resistance. Where was that resistance from, and what was their reasoning for redacting anything?
So, even before I had gone to Beverly Pagan's house, the scientist in Maine, I had spent some time at the State Archives in Albany, New York, and they have lots of records related to Love Canal. And as you know, reporters and researchers are wont to do, every time you go to an archive, you just search for anything related to your topics, your characters, everybody, even though it's unlikely that you're going to find anything about most of it, right? So while I was there, I did a search in the database for Beverly Pagan. And, you know, in the history of the state of New York, there have probably been millions, maybe tens of millions of state employees. And I can assure you that not all of them get a file at the State Archive. But Beverly Pagan had a file. And it said Beverly Pagan Employment File. So I asked to see it. And they denied me. They said it was private, it was a private matter. As a person, you can't see it's a private employment matter. So I informed Beverly of the file upon my trips to Maine, and you know, she said she was going to place her own request to try to get it. And of course, I placed my own request in tandem for a Freedom of Information request to see the file. My last visit to Beverly was in, I think it was February 13th, 2020. Her husband died about 5 days later, her partner of 50 years. And then the pandemic hit and everything shut down, and Beverly dies in June of 2020. And she had never made her request. So I had my only pending FOIA request, mine. And it took 10 months for it to come back. I had to keep calling and calling and calling. And when it did, it was about 330 pages and of shielded documents. And Beverly had long believed that she was being followed. She had no way to prove it, but she at times would make phone calls cloak and dagger style from payphones, or wouldn't take calls in her office. She found that her mail was being opened. And I have no evidence for any of that, although she did lodge the mail opening complaint in 1979. It was lodged then. But what I can tell you from those documents is that I don't know if they were following her in the way we'd like to imagine in some police procedural on TV, but they were following her. They wanted to know who she was speaking to and when, what she said and how. The top people at the top of the health department and all the way up to the governor of New York were very interested in what Beverly had to say. And as to why 42 years later they would redact some of these memos among people who are now all gone, I cannot say. Again, it was said to me they were redacted for privacy reasons. But in those files in Maine, Beverly had some of these same memos, right? Not the internal memos that went back and forth between two administrators in Albany, but a memo that she might have sent, and she had that, or a memo that she had received, and she had that. And so at times in these 330 documents, I was able to say, well, this is the memo that I got from the state redacted, and this is the memo from Beverly's file. It's the same memo, and I cannot tell you why some of those lines were redacted. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. It was awesome. Thank you.